Good day, everyone. My name is Sean Cash, and I'm an economist with the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. I'm also a board member and the program chair of CFAIR, the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. It's CFAIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the applied economics profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in applied economics. Next slide, please. Today, CFAIR is partnering with the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, or AERE, to cover the issue of public land use within the United States and shed light on the potential impacts this has on the United States economy. We're really glad that you've taken the time to join us today. Next slide, please.
Our first panelist is Margaret Walls. She is a senior fellow and economist at Resources for the Future.
Great. So I'm happy to talk to you all today about multiple use public lands and some of the conflicts, trade-offs, and future challenges. Next slide. So I'm going to start with giving a little bit of a federal lands overview because this will be helpful, I think, also for Kevin and Courtney. Just so to make sure everybody's on the same page, the U.S. has about 640 million acres of federally owned and managed lands. That's 28% of the U.S. land area. As you can see from the map in the west, it's quite a bit of land that's taken up by the federal government, over half. The four main federal land management agencies are the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, the National Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. Today we're going to be talking about three of those primarily. The BLM is the largest of the landowners at 245 million acres, and that's what I'm going to mostly focus on in my talk. So BLM lands, so that everybody knows, are really what I would refer to as the leftover lands. So after we gave away lands to homesteaders, to states, to railroads, to timber companies, these are the lands that were kind of left over. They're mostly arid, a lot of high altitude, some spectacular scenery, but they're mostly the lands that weren't really that productive in agriculture. The Bureau of Land Management is governed by the 1976 Federal Lands Policy and Management Act, or FLPMA. So that sort of tells the BLM what it's supposed to do with these lands. It was when that law was passed, it authorized these sort of leftover lands be retained by the federal government. So before that, it was mostly what they called disposal, giving the lands away. But now they're, after 1976, they're pretty much retained and managed by the BLM. It established a multiple use and sustained yield mandate for BLM. That means that multiple use means balancing across all the different uses that take place on the lands, and sustained yield means to manage the resources for present and future generations. It also mandated land use planning, so that's a big part of what BLM does, is figuring out what's going to happen where through detailed resource management plans. Next slide. So multiple use indeed. These pictures give you a little bit of a view of what's happening on these lands, and just looked up a few statistics. Currently, there's 26 million acres, or about 11% of the lands, that are leased for oil and gas. There's 35 million acres in what's known as the National Conservation Land System. So those are protected lands in the form of national monuments, national conservation areas, wilderness study areas, and other sites. A lot of grazing goes on BLM lands. 155 million acres currently are used for grazing. And I want to be clear, these sites overlap. So there's grazing in national monuments, for example. And renewable energy is increasingly a focus for federal lands. There are 700,000 acres in what are called designated leasing areas, which are supposed to be expedited permitting. And the BLM has estimated that there's a lot of land that's actually excellent potential for wind and solar. And BLM is heavily visited by people for recreation, all kinds of recreation. And over the last 10 years, that's gone up by about 20%. Next slide, please. So this multiple use mandate has just generated conflicts and controversies over time. They're long-standing, and in particular over extractive uses of the land and grazing, but especially extractive uses versus conservation. And I'm going to spend just a few moments to talk about national monuments because they're particularly fraught. So national monuments are historic landmarks. They're lands that contain historic landmarks, historic or prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest. That's language from the 1906 Antiquities Act, which gives the president the ability to proclaim federal lands as national monuments. That's how many of our monuments have been created, but they're also created through legislation. The BLM managed monuments are large, sometimes hundreds of thousands of acres, and have been particularly contentious. Opponents often fear that they're going to lose jobs and income when these lands are protected because it will cut off future, let's say, oil and gas leasing and other activities. And then proponents often counter that growth is going to come from a different kind of economy, more amenity-based. Next slide. So I just want to tell you quickly about a recent study that I did with some co-authors on the economic impacts of national monuments. So in this study, we had longitudinal microdata on all the establishments over a 25-year period in an 8-state Western region, with detailed industry classifications and the number of jobs in each establishment. So we used methods that compare before and after designation to so-called treatment areas or areas near the monuments with those outside of a little farther away from the monuments. And that's kind of illustrated in these maps where green is treated and yellow farther out would be considered control. And we then looked at what happens to these areas after designation. Next slide, please. We really tried to answer this question that people fight over. Are these monuments more of a good thing or a bad thing? Our findings suggest more of a good thing. So we found a 10% average increase in the number of business establishments and an 8.5% average increase in the number of jobs in zip codes within 25 kilometers of a monument. We saw a 0.6 percentage point increase in the net annual growth rate of new establishments, so the rate at which new businesses locate on net, and no change at all in the annual average jobs growth rate, no change in wage incomes or wage income growth rate. So on the whole, we looked at a lot of different things, mostly positive outcomes, some zero outcomes, no negative outcomes. Next slide, please. So this protected land issue is going to continue, and I want to talk about three things that I see as important public lands issues for 2021 and beyond that are at the top of the policy plate. And this first one does have to do with protections, and that's the 30 by 30 mandate. So this is in the climate executive order that came out from President Biden. And it tells the Secretary of the Interior to recommend steps to achieve conservation of at least 30% of U.S. land and waters by 2030. This is an international goal around the world that people have been focusing on, and now it's part of a mandate in the U.S. So I think there's going to be a lot of focus on this, and the question is, there's a lot of questions with this. So in my opinion, the getting to 30, well, where are we now? Depending on the definitions of what you mean by protected lands, but I think we're at about 14% of US lands, and not waters. I'm just going to focus on lands that are protected. How are we going to get to 30 and where are we going to do it are two big questions that are looming large at the moment. For federal lands, what we could do is designate more of the BLM lands as protected, so as national monuments, as wilderness areas, and so forth. Is that what we want to do? Is that the best way to do it? What do we get from that? I highly recommend a Defenders of Wildlife report from last summer that gets into some of the trade-offs and the types of lands and where they are in terms of achieving various objectives that we want from conservation. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about two more policy issues, and both of them have to do with energy. The first is oil and gas leasing policies. So this is another part of the EO on climate, and that is that the Secretary of Interior was supposed to pause and has paused new oil and gas leases on public lands, pending completion of a comprehensive review. So Federal lands currently account for about 22% of oil production and 12% of natural gas production in the US. For coal, it's much higher, but I'm going to focus on oil and gas. So the question here is, what are we going to do after this pause? What should leasing policy reforms look like, especially as we really take serious tackling the climate crisis? Next slide. So let me tell you about a study that's really going to have a lot to say about this, and that's by my colleague Brian Prest at Resources for the Future. He has a model of oil and gas drilling and production, and he separates public lands from private and runs some policy simulations to look at these three options for policy reform: a permanent ban or moratorium, an increase in the royalty rates on federal lands, and a carbon adder, or a fee on production that's based on the carbon content, so kind of like a carbon tax. And these graphs are a little bit busy, but I think the big takeaway here that you should see, first of all, is in the green graph, the green bars, if there's a moratorium, we're losing a lot of revenues from public lands, and that will be a big issue. What Brian finds in his study is that the carbon adder actually generates quite a bit more revenues from public lands and reduces carbon emissions on net almost as much as the moratorium. Changes in the royalty rate don't do much for carbon emissions because that's not a big difference beyond what it's a big difference from where we are. It's a 25% compared to 12.5% currently, but it isn't going to do a lot for carbon emissions. Next slide, please. And the final of the three policy issues I wanted to mention have to do with renewable energy. So in the Consolidated Appropriations Act in December 2020, which passed, there is a goal to achieve 25 gigawatts of electricity from wind, solar, and geothermal by 2025. The Climate Executive Order also mentions reviewing siting and permitting so that we can increase renewable energy production. It's clear this is going to be a focus. We're not very far along this path right now. And what are some of the issues? Location, 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 as they say in the real estate world. And that has to do with grid access, potential for the resource, and many other competing issues, as always with BLM lands, such as habitat, ecological considerations, recreation, and so forth. I'll also mention that lease costs and federal revenues is a big deal. If we lose revenues from the oil and gas side, are we going to make it up on the renewable side? Currently, renewables do not generate much revenues. Next slide. And this is my last slide. So I just want to conclude by saying some of these conflicts and controversies over uses of multiple use federal lands like BLMs are likely to grow, in my opinion, both as conservation and recreation values continue to rise and the US transitions away from fossil fuels. Some of the challenges here, in my view, are going to be equity for these fossil fuel dependent rural communities near public lands and the revenues that these states are going to lose, $1.5 billion in FY 2020. Using lands to support a growing outdoor recreation economy, or maybe more importantly, in my view, how can the outdoor recreation economy support public lands? And finally, FLPMA is 45 years old. So in general, is it time to revisit and rethink the law that governs these lands? So thank you.
Our second panelist is Courtney Schultz. She is an associate professor of forest and natural resource policy at Colorado State University.
Thanks, Sean. I'm going to talk today about some new directions and challenges in national forest management. And similarly to the BLM, the national forests are governed by a multiple use and sustained yield mandate. So forests are kind of doing everything for everyone. They are being managed for commodity production, timber, grazing, everything to biodiversity protection, watershed, and wilderness. And they cover almost 200 million acres across the US, primarily in the Western US. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of our major challenges today on national forests, there's quite a lot of them. I'm going to focus on the land management side of things as it relates to fire management. What we're really grappling with is just the pace and extent of change. So we're seeing huge die-offs as a result of insect and disease, followed by drought and fire. And sometimes those disturbances are actually layering on top of each other, causing forests to not come back as forests or to convert to a different kind of ecosystem. So a lot of what we're really trying to do now is to figure out how do we adapt our legal system and our partnerships to grapple with that extent of change on the landscape. And that means promoting collaboration to work across jurisdictional boundaries and also leveraging diverse capacities. And so this isn't just a collaboration to build agreement that we're all familiar with from the 1990s and beyond. This is moving more towards a networked governance system where partners are bringing a tremendous amount of capacity to work across jurisdictions and also to bring their own expertise and funding to the table. And by partners, I mean not just NGO partners, but also other government entities. There's three big things I think we're working on right now. Forest restoration is a huge one, and that's more on the land management side of things, but it's really meant to address issues related to fire. So we want to make forests more restored to natural conditions because we've suppressed fire for a long time. And I'm talking really about our frequent fire, dry adapted forests. So not all of our forests, but a lot of them in the West. Make them more resilient in the face of climate change. And this involves mechanical thinning. And then what's most important is getting fire back on the ground through prescribed fire or natural fire. So even though we're seeing a lot of fire, a big thing we're trying to do is actually get more natural fire on the ground under more low and moderate intensity conditions. And then, of course, improving fire response. Fire has gone from taking 20% to over 65% of the Forest Service's budget today. So we have to figure out how to make that more cost effective. And then addressing climate change. And in terms of the administration's priorities, they're really focused around managing forests to be resilient to climate change. So this is more of a climate change adaptation strategy so that they burn less intensely. And estimates are that that's going to require some major increase in funding for forest management, maybe on the order of $5 billion a year, the estimates I've seen recently over the next 10 years to really make a difference. And then also using forests as a natural climate solution. Next slide, please. So I'm taking some of this from the Climate 21 transition memo, and I pulled up here some of the Department of Ag. And if you could click to the next slide, there's some of the top recommendations that show up here for the Department of Ag are really to prioritize federal investment to address wildfire. And so again, this is both to make our forests more adaptable in the face of climate change, but also so we don't lose our forests and we can maintain them as important carbon stocks and sources of carbon sequestration. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk about a couple of interesting policy things that are going on that I've been looking at over the last few years. And so one is this whole new kind of policy tool. I think this is really fascinating because it's like an entirely new kind of policy we didn't see till about 10 years ago. And it's embodied in the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, which was set up by Congress in 2009, and the Joint Chiefs Partnership, which was set up by NRCS and the Forest Service internally to the agencies in 2013. So both of these policies, I would call them focused investment models in that they commit multiple years of funding to a particular landscape, but through a competitive prioritization process. So you have to put in an application with collaborative partners and the federal agencies and basically make a case for why is your landscape worth this multi-year investment. But if you get it, then you get this focused investment with flexible funding, requirements for collaboration, working at scale, and these policies have broad goals that can be tailored to local contexts. This is kind of like the magic that the whole environmental governance literature recommends around the world, is finding policies that allow you to do these kinds of things. We've done surveys and interviews with folks, and they've said that these kinds of policies have led to better relationships, better pace and scale of projects, innovations on things like monitoring and adaptive management, and then networked learning across projects. And almost everyone says this is really marking the path forward for how we want to operate on our national forests. Next slide, please. But there were some particular challenges. One is the agency turnover that can really interfere with collaboration. And then another is the lack of agency capacity. I mean, estimates in 2015 were that the agency had gone from 20,000 to 11,000 people in the national forest system because of so much money going to wildfire fighting. So there's a huge capacity issue. And then there's the challenge of engaging industry. I think for a while we thought maybe we can figure out how to work with industry at a large enough scale to make a valuable product from these low value wood products. I think now we know that that's not going to be the only solution, that this is also going to take some significant public investment to get a lot of the overgrown wood off the landscape. But industry is always going to be a critical partner, and wood products are going to be a good co-benefit of restoration. So how do we engage that more effectively? And then how do we maintain long-term investments in places where we've worked so we don't lose, so we get a return on investment. But I think it's really cool that we've seen major changes to the scales of planning going on national forests and to collaborative partnerships through policy change. And now some big questions are, how do we deal with the politics of prioritization, winners and losers, engage industry, and build collaborative capacity where we don't have it? Next slide, please. We've also been working a lot on prescribed fire because this is something that we know we need to be doing more of, and we're not getting done on the landscapes in the West. And so we had a project funded by the Joint Fire Science Program to investigate policy barriers to prescribed fire. I think there was a general narrative out there that it had to do with air quality permitting. But when we did kind of a deep dive diagnosing what are the challenges and solutions, we actually heard it had a lot more to do with lack of staff capacity and lack of strong leadership on these issues, sometimes because leaders are risk averse. People said that collaboration at multiple system levels really is important to mark the path forward. And I'll give you one example. We heard a lot about the importance of collaboration at the state level so that you can leverage state funds and state forestry agencies to work on national forests and across boundaries, but also so air and land managers at the state level, where a lot of the air quality regulation happens, can really talk to each other. So we're seeing a lot of state level collaboration forming, and I think this is a really important next step to improving how national forests are being managed. Next slide, please. So on this project, I just wanted to highlight a couple things that I think are sort of generally true in national forest management right now. That's the critical importance of partnerships to leverage capacity, to work at scale, and to deal with funding shortfalls. Having that collaboration at multiple levels, really having strong leadership direction to focus on long-term goals with the right incentives. And then there is this looming challenge in fire management and national forest management, if we're going to put more fire on the ground, of how we're going to get enough done. If you can click to the next slide, there's this quote that someone told me that said, we have to get fire back on the landscape through natural ignition because I can't plan enough to do it. So I think this is a big direction we're going. Next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight that we wrote about all of those policies in this policy forum article in Science, and it was great to see a little more on the governance side of the fire and forest management problem in there. And then next slide, we also have written about some of the deep organizational issues that have come up in this other piece, the Forest Service fire management and the elusiveness of change, where we look at both the land management side and the response side and kind of what are some of the deep incentives and psychological issues that are limiting our ability to make progress. Next slide, please. I'll just highlight one more thing, which is some research we've been doing around this big practice of vulnerability assessment that's going on across national forests. These are done through these science and management partnerships where scientists work together to identify vulnerabilities with managers to identify possible management actions. A big question has been whether mitigation and adaptation can work together on the same landscape. And I think we're finding that these actually overlap quite well. But there are some new legal challenges like the FLIPMA. The NIFMA hasn't been updated for 45 years. We may need to look at whether or not it allows public lands to be used and managed for carbon stocks. And then also look at these specific opportunities for planning for climate change with probably new performance metrics and incentives to drive the agency in that direction. Next slide, please. So just some last things I'm thinking about, how can we effectively respond to the pace of change with our current legal and governance system? What's that going to require? And how do we respond post-fire or post-disturbance? Because that's becoming a bigger proportion of our landscape. Engaging wood products industry, supporting climate adaptation and mitigation, building community capacity to live with more fire, particularly in the West, and then actually designing the policies to support an increased role for partner states and tribes that are all elevating in this space. But I think we have to figure out how to actually facilitate that work across boundaries. So with that, you can go to the last slide. I'll say thanks and look forward to the conversation.
Our final panelist is Kevin Boyle. He is a professor at Virginia Tech University in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics.
So today I'm going to talk about 4 studies that we did for the National Park Service that were run through Industrial Economics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And those studies were not done to look at specific policies, but more in general to address a number of different policies that the Park Service may see down the road, with the exception of the last one, which dealt with a specific national policy. And in talking today, I'm going to talk about national monuments, national seashore, national parks, covering the different types of sites the Park Service manages. And I'm going to talk about individual sites, groups of sites, and then a national policy. And the results of these studies have application for issues such as access fees and funding, crowding, closures, and environmental quality in parks. And so I'm going to walk through each of the studies a little bit and then talk a little bit at the end about how some of the implications of these might carry forward. Next slide, please. So the first one was a study we did at Fort Sumter, and looking at access fees to value access to the park. And here it's Fort Sumter. If you're not familiar with it, you need to take a ferry boat out to the fort in order to have a tour and visit it. And so what we looked at was how much people going out to the fort would pay in an increased access fee to the site. And having information about this gives you a value of what people place on going to visit the site. So we could come up with a value that the public places on the site, aggregating that across people and visits to the site. But it also gives important information to think about what types of access fees are possible for people going to the site if that was going to be used as a revenue generator. For Fort Sumter, it's unique compared to some other ones you drive to because you need to take a boat out to it. And right now the fee is just for the boat tour out to it and not for the site itself. Next one. The second one is looking, rather than for one site, is looking at multiple site visitation in the Four Corners area. And so here we're looking at a number of national park facilities. And we in the left we show just a schematic of somebody flying into Phoenix, renting a car, driving to Scottsdale, Sedona, going to the Grand Canyon, up to Lake Powell, Monument Valley, up to Arches and Moab, Canyonlands, Bryce, Zion, dropping their car off in Las Vegas and flying back. And a lot of the economic studies that have been done have looked at visitation to a single park, or multiple ones, but treating them each individually. And this is different in that it looks at how people package their trips. And if you're thinking about issues such as crowding, this type of model that we put together, if you're limiting access into the park at a certain time, you can only allow so many visitors, let's say into Arches. How are people going to substitute their trips? How are they going to take a different path when they come out to visit? Because a policy at one park can't be thought of as independent of other ones when they're packaging trips like this. It's kind of like pushing on a mobile, and when you push on one part, other parts are likely to move when you do it. And so this was an important study in kind of looking at how people package a set of sites to visit in a trip. Let's go to the next slide, please. The third one is looking at Padre Island National Seashore. And here, what we're doing is looking at valuation of visits to the Padre Island National Seashore, but we're also looking at substitutes to other sites, just state sites and local sites where when people come to that area to visit the beaches. And this one's important because when you're thinking about it, I was talking about in the previous one in substitution between different national park sites, but if you have something like an oil spill that happens and you close the beach, where do people go? What other types of state and local facilities do they visit? And so it gives you an idea of some of the substitution that goes on, you know, thinking about pushing on that mobile of what's going to happen to sites that are not just under the entity of the Park Service, but other ones as people substitute in changing their behavior because of a closure or limited use. And so, you know, you could have the image on the right shows oil from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. It doesn't all the way go down to South Padre Island, but you know that oil spill resulted in closures of beaches, and then it effects on the quality of the beach when there was oil there. And so you can look at either a closure, or you can look at the effects of diminished quality when you visit the park. Next slide, please. And the fourth study is a national study that we did for the Park Service, looking at the regional haze rule, which has a goal of reducing haze in national parks, haze due to air pollution, to background levels. And so if you looked at it, you know, the picture on the left, these are in Colorado, has less haze. The picture on the right has more haze. And the regional haze rule goal is to reduce that haze, so you don't see the images like on the right when you visit, and you do see the images on the left. And that was a national study, and if you look in the upper right, you can see how we divided the country up into different segments. And there's an interesting twist to this, and when we think about the previous two speakers, in that BLM lands, Forest Service lands are also affected by this, because the regional haze rule applies to Class 1 visibility areas, which is national parks and wilderness areas. And so you have wilderness areas on BLM lands and in national forests. And so the results of this study are cross-cutting from Park Service to Forest Service to BLM lands. And with this policy, the states had to have mitigation plans in place by 2018, updated plan, 2008, and they're supposed to update them every 10 years with updated ones in 2018. And so this is a progression of moving from what were current conditions when the law was first passed to reaching background levels. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of some of the results from those studies. But if you look at it and start with Fort Sumter in the first row, where we did site visitation, these are all in 2021 dollars. And so if you look at that first row, it's about $13 per visitor that they would be willing to pay, above and beyond what they have to pay for the access fee to the site, above and beyond that what they paid for the boat and the tour. And so if you look at these valuation results, and you were thinking, you know, there's been discussion about fees charged at national parks and increasing them, which is a very hot topic. For Fort Sumter, it would say that if you had a $13 fee, the average visitor would be indifferent between visiting Fort Sumter or not. A fee below $13, let's say a $5 or $10 one, then more than half of the visitors would be willing to pay it. If you go above that, then less than half would be willing to pay it. So it gives you an idea of what the possibilities might be in terms of access fees that could be help with the type funding of the Park Service. Then if we move down to the next one, the Southwest Parks, the values I have here range from $13 to $298, and these are per party per trip values. And here I'm looking at a single park closure. You know, for example, there was a tank truck spill years ago that closed down access to arches for a period of time, so people couldn't get in. And so this would tell you that gives you an idea of what the loss would be to a party if they were on a trip and could not get into arches and had to go on beyond it or another park. Likewise, this same model can be used in saying, you know, what might happen with substitution, not just in what the party lost in value, but what might happen with substitution. How might people change their trips if they encountered an unexpected change like that? Or if you started, you know, looking at limited access because you can only handle so many cars in a site like arches, what would you do in terms of, you know, where might people go? Will they stay there and visit it anyways, or will they move on? And does it have kind of like an accordion effect of increasing the use and maybe crowding at other parks on their itinerary as they substitute? And then for the third one down, Padre Island National Seashore, looking at a beach closure due to an oil spill. That would be $4 per visit. And we also did a scenario and said, you know, what if there was a 5-month closure? That would be a loss in value to visitors of $15.4 million of people visiting there. And once again, this model could actually be used to say, if they can't go to South Padre Island, this is not a package one like the Southwest, but to one site, that model can still help tell you where else might people go in the interim if they weren't going to visit South Padre Island. So it can also look at managing crowding and where people visit. And then the National Park Visitability one, looking at 100% improvement, basically bringing it back to background levels like the goal of the policy. Values range there from about $60 to $217 per household. For those are payments per year for 15 years. And those values vary over the different parts of the country where we segmented our study. And so you can see that, you know, kind of the preferences as measured in the magnitude of values of how much people will pay for those improvements vary substantially when you're in different regions of the country. And so this last one in closing is an example of looking at a specific policy, whereas the other three were studies that were done that could be used to look at a number of different policies as the Park Service required economic information to help support decision making. And so with that, I'll say thank you and turn it back over to Sean.
That Seafair's signature annual event, the Brand Forum, is coming up. And we invite you to join us for our 2021 annual Brand Forum, which brings together scholars and business leaders to discuss the disruptions of digitalization in agriculture. Because of the pandemic, we've shifted this to a 2-day virtual event on April 2nd and April 5th, both days running 10 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. To register for this event, please go to www.seafair.live. In the follow-up email to this event, we'll also provide links for more information on the upcoming Brand Forum event if you're interested. Next slide. Before we say goodbye, we wanted to point out that Seafair is online at seafair.org and encourage those who enjoyed this webinar to sign up for our newsletter, where you'll get more information on related events. We're also on Twitter, and all of our programs are available on our YouTube channel. You can find it by searching for our name on YouTube. That's the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. Please follow us and subscribe. We also encourage any and all inquiries to information@seafair.org. Next slide. Wanted to pass along a quick word of thanks to our partners. This and other Seafair programming wouldn't be possible without the continuing support of the Agriculture and Applied Economics Association, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Agricultural Statistical Service, as well as the department's Economic Research Service, also provided financial support. The Association of Environmental and Resource Economists played a crucial role in the organization of this event. For all the assistance they provided, thank you. For more information on AERE, please visit aere.org. Next slide. Finally, one last thank you to our panelists and to you, the audience. We're passionate about topics of food, agriculture, resource, and the environment, and we know that you are too. But it's still not a small thing to give up at lunchtime hour and spend it with us. Please do follow us on Twitter as well for more information on future events. We hope you enjoyed this event as much as we enjoyed hosting it. Take care.